You're sticking on that.
Parish.
Those are the wet spots.
The masks are good for something.
The wet spots.
All right. I'd like to call for the meeting of the Board of Supervisors. It's a budget work session. Today is March 10th. All supervisors are present. If we would all stand for the pledge of allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Now a moment of silence. Thank you. Now, adoption of the agenda. It's pretty short and sweet. If I can have a motion.
Move that we adopt the agenda as presented.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.
For the benefit of the two people at home, perhaps we can identify the names of who are making motions, seconds.
Ms. Smith and Mr. Parrish.
Although there probably won't be many more votes tonight.
After you, Mr. Curry.
Okay. Now that's that time of year again where we're talking about budget. The schools had their budget presentation, a public hearing last night. Dr. Grimsley is online with us, so that's nice to see her there. I'm going to broadcast on my screen the budget so the folks at home can see it. It'll be up on the screen there, a little presentation. And hopefully everything will work correctly. And maybe the folks, Dr. Grimsley, if you could just confirm that you can see the presentation or hear us.
Yes, sir. Both.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Right. I've set this presentation up very similar to how it was. I've done it in the past. Apologize for folks in the audience who have to wrap their necks. Let me turn that TV on. All right, now I think we're ready to go. So this is fiscal year 22, and we're here to talk about the budget. Same agenda as before. We'll just walk through the major budget inputs, tell you the whole story in one slide, and then we'll go through the details. As you know very well, the process that we've worked through over the last several years, the department agency budget holders send the requests to me. The outside agencies send requests to me. I compile all that information after working with the schools. Added to the slide this morning that Dr. Grimsley was sending me information this morning to make sure we were all synced up after their meeting last night. And then I'm making a proposed budget to the board right now, and that's consistent with the requirements of the Code of Virginia. After this meeting, the board will work through this document, consider different aspects of it. The public will have their opportunity to work alongside of you during work sessions, and eventually mold my proposed budget into your proposed budget. And your proposed budget will be put before the public as a public hearing, also consistent with the Code of Virginia. And then you will adopt in May. The school budget must be adopted by May 15th. Now, the past several years, the entire budget has been adopted either at the May meeting or a work session very shortly thereafter. So this year we've had several inputs to consider. Health insurance is a slight decrease. All members of the pool had a 4% decrease added after our actuarial study information. Because we're such a small pool, our actual results don't really impact our insurance rates. We get whatever the pool gets, the small group pool. So that entire pool went up 3%, but then when you reduce it 4%, we ultimately have a 1% reduction. This is the second year of the 2-year cycle for VRS, so that's flat. The state, the General Assembly included a 5% cost of living allowance in their budget, the conference budget for both the county and schools. I say county, that's constitutional officers and state responsible employees. We tried to fit in some corrections to our salary scale based on the Baker-Tilly classification compensation study last year, but COVID got in the way, and I'm working to get that implemented this year. Sheriff has requested an additional patrol deputy. Reassessment, we're in a second year of a 2-year cycle there. Paid EMS providers has been a big discussion over the last several months. And then we recognize the continuing need for recurring one-time contribution capital. So all that said, this budget funds the 5% raise for county staff, partially funded by the state. Funds an additional $115,000 in the board contingency line to be allocated at a later time to implement the classification compensation study. And that would replace the current longevity incentive programs that are on the books that are different for different departments and very confusing, and require raises for employees based on how long they've been here rather than their performance. It funds the superintendent's and now the school board's proposed budget that includes a 5% increase, also partially supported by state budget. It continues to fund, as in past years, 100% of the operational budget of the 7 fire and rescue companies, and provides $60,000 in capital assistance to those companies, which is not required by the agreement, but has been provided over the last several years. It does not require any real estate or personal property tax rate increase. It does propose an increase to the transient occupancy tax, which is your lodging tax, from 2% now to 4%. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then specifically regarding the Ems Provider Costs, this budget sets aside funding for part-time ALS EMS providers at $24 an hour, 24/7, 365. So one person, 24/7, 365 at $24 an hour. It also sets aside $68,000, a little more than that, of recurring funding for operational needs of those EMS providers. Doesn't dive into the details of that yet, and that'll be worked on over the next several months. Provides $150,000 for one-time capital needs for those EMS providers, and then includes or recognizes a $50,000 transfer from the fire service fund to the general fund to support these EMS providers. So these providers are funded out of the general fund. This document is attached to board docs, as is the detailed budget. So if you can't see these numbers at home or from the audience, you can refer to all of this later. As noted last year and years prior, the overall county budget is the summation of several independent, smaller budgets. And it really isn't that complex. These several lines as shown here are all their own budget. So you have the general fund, and I'm comparing the FY21 original budget and this FY22 county administrator proposed budget. You can see the revenue and the expenditure for each budget, each fund match. So each fund is balanced and the entire budget is balanced. And then you can see some growth between 21 and 22. So this is a roll up, and each one of these individual budgets is a sum of many parts themselves. For example, the school fund, Fund 207, is over $13 million and was subject to its own meeting last night by the school board. And it's very detailed and has a lot of parts in it, as opposed to the law library has a single line, and it's just a unique portion of state law that has a separate court fee that goes towards that. So each line budgeted or balanced for each fund to itself, and the overall budget balanced. This is important. Looking at those same numbers, but in a chart form, you can see the breakdown or percentage of each of the different funds relative to each other. But this is a very misleading chart because the general fund includes transfers to several of the other funds. So of the school fund, which was $13 million, $9 million of that is coming from the general fund. So it's kind of counted twice here. So a better way to look at this is through those same funds, but net of all transfers. So the funding is only shown where it's actually spent out the door. And you can see here, this table shows FY 20, 21, and 22. And I'll note that it's the original budget as opposed to amended budget throughout the year for 20 and 21. And then the difference is between 21 and 22. So you can see fund growth between 21 and 22, recognizing that 21 was an atypical year for us because the board restricted revenue in many areas, not knowing what COVID was going to do, and moved some money around and held money in BOS contingency in some areas rather than perhaps pass it over to the school fund. So that's why some of those changes are shown here, and you'll see as we go through where some of those changes occurred. This is just again, that high level overview of each balanced fund and how it's grown over time. But then looking at that in a graphic perspective, this is a much better perspective of actually the dollars that are spent in the community, the dollars that are heading out the door to some outside source, whether it's staff or a supplier. So the school fund comprises 48.4% of your budget on dollars spent, and general fund expenditure is 28.8%. And you can see the breakdown, the other funds, whether it's CSA and social services, capital fund, debt service fund, the cost recovery fund, which is really just a pass-through, library fund, and the school cafeteria fund. So if you add the school cafeteria fund to the school fund, you're getting pretty close to 50% of the budget. Well, the cafeteria fund includes all of the expenses for food, all the expenses for services for the people that work in the cafeteria, and you can think of all those meals that are purchased. Those dollars flow through that cafeteria fund in both schools. So now looking at each of those funds net of transfers over the last 3 years, and that first column, sorry, my Zoom thing is covering that up. I can find a better spot for it. FY 20, 21, and 22 again, you can see in this stacked bar chart the relative growth of the different sections over time. And again, I'll note that CARES Act has done some weird things to these relative proportions in 21. But when you look at it this perspective, it's not that far off. FY 22 includes over $500,000 of CARES Act, of SR2 fund grant money from the schools, which is one reason why you can see their slice is quite a bit larger. But it's outside dollars, not coming from the county. And if I rumble on too quickly or too slowly, please let me know. And looking over time again, looking at FY 19, 20, 21, and then 22 requested and proposed, both the original and the amended budget. And every year we go through the process to true up the budget with new revenue that comes in. And so in 21, that included realizing the second tranche of CARES Act funds. Most years, it also includes the reconciliation of federal and grant money that's coming into the schools that just is not known at this time. You have to remember, we're budgeting right now for dollars that may be spent 16 or 17 months from now. So a lot happens between now and then. And so the original versus amended gives you an idea. We're on a pretty consistent pattern of growth. And this is a little bit misleading because the chart starts at $10 million to accentuate the differentiation. But you can see there's kind of a straight line growth going across each one of these years on the original budget. I've included this graph in the last several years to give the board and public an idea of the relative proportion of each of these different service areas that is funded by our local revenue versus state revenue. There's not a lot of similarity, but you can see social services, the dark blue is non-local revenue, which is state and federal in this case. Of all of our practice areas, social services is mostly funded by others, as opposed to your local tax dollars, whereas the library, which is also maybe a little misleading, is mostly funded locally, but 100,000 of that local fund is from their investment fund, and the 62 is from state. And then you can see as it goes through the middle, looks like children's services is a little less than 50% local, and that makes sense because of the match rates that go into that program. So when somebody says that the clerk of the circuit court is paid for by the state, that's not exactly true. It's partially paid for by the state. So now drilling into the general fund revenue in detail, you may gather that we're spending more money this year, so there must be more money coming in because it is a balanced budget. We did say, even though a few meetings ago I said I was expecting flat revenue growth, you always want to undersell and over deliver. So we have seen natural revenue growth, and the board has seen it monthly in your meetings when we were looking at the sales tax and meals and lodging tax received. The biggest boost was in sales tax. But as we look through here, as I noted before, with the lodging tax rate increase from 2 to 4%, and as Ms. Graham noted at the last board meeting, we're guessing that's about $40,000. And I think that moving to 4% makes a lot of sense because your meals tax is 4%. And this is particularly matching those two rates up, whether it be 4 and 4, 5 and 5, 6 and 6, whatever it may be. And meals could go up to 6 according to the Code of Virginia now if you wanted to. Your B&Bs who have lodging and meals no longer would have to really worry about which portion is meals and which portion is lodging. And we do have that special code section that allows us to bill them combined, but they prefer to separate it if they can pay fewer taxes. But if you align those tax rates, then it's pretty simple arithmetic.
And at what point do we have to set aside any additional revenue for tourism promotion? Is it above 4%?
About 2%.
It's
So
above 2. So this 40 grand is just going to be earmarked for.
yes, and it very nicely fits with the fact that your tourism department is about $40,000.
So that includes back into the general fund. And
Right.
This revenue replaces that.
Yes.
Okay.
So I went through every single revenue line and looked at the trend over the last 12 months, 20 months, going back just to get an idea of what's happening, see if it's a CARES Act thing, see if it's a long-term trend in projected revenue that way. Had Ms. Nick review things as well and back check my assumptions, and we conferred on all this. She was the primary driver on the general property estimates, as she has been in the last several years, and I appreciate her helping out with that. As I noted, the state, the General Assembly authorized the 5% raise for state responsible local employees, and as well as school employees. Unfortunately, while the school's calculation tool was updated yesterday afternoon, the state compensation board won't have theirs updated until the 12th. So I had to make certain assumptions on what that revenue would be based on the revenue we had in the past, and 5%, and that math's not too tricky. But there are some other changes that I'm looking to confirm. The General Assembly action did also increase the registrar salary reimbursement through a few actions, but it's not clear yet exactly what there's an extra $3.5 million in the state budget, and nobody really knows exactly what that will accomplish. But it will accomplish more than in the past, and so we're grateful for that. And as I noted, also in the general fund, we have $50,000 coming into the general fund from the fire service fund. You can see that at the bottom of this table, whereas in 21 there was no transfer into the general fund from the fire service fund, and now there's 50,000. So looking down this chart, you can see general property. That's your real estate tax, personal property tax, primarily $150,000 increase. In the detailed budget, which is attached and in front of you, shows each line item and shows the change. Other local taxes is your sales tax, meals and lodging tax, a few others, but those are the primary drivers. And I did not take or recognize all of the revenue that is projected for those line items. I think if I remember right, over the last 12 months, we've received $760,000 of sales tax. But I'm not recognizing all that, thinking that there may be more online shopping now than there will be in the next fiscal year. So some of that we'll see.
What, remind me, what is use of money and property? What is that item, line item?
Yeah, that's reduced interest.
Oh, that's all it is. Okay.
Well, there's a few other things there, but the reason that line is reduced by 55,000 is the interest rates are just nothing now.
Yep.
Even though we have plenty in the bank, there's no interest rate, and so we're not generating much
Is that
revenue
I mean, you calculated that somehow, I guess.
there. I looked at actuals,
Okay.
so it's very likely that the rates aren't going to go below where they are now or have been over the last 12 months or so. And so we may actually get more than that if the rates creep up, but that's a safe number to budget. Fines and forfeitures were a little bit down, but they may end up being a little higher when the courts are actually fully back into swing, but didn't want to make any too gross assumptions there. Overall, this is fairly conservative. We're not reaching for revenue in any particular line. Every line is carefully analyzed and pretty safe. And at the end of the day, when you look at this in the general fund, it's $669,000 more than last year, but we the board very cautiously underachieved on your revenue forecast last year. So it looks like more than it really is as far as that growth from year to year. And in FY21, we will way exceed our revenue forecast in the budget. And we've seen that in the sales tax and meals and lodging tax. So looking at those revenue numbers in a relative graphical form, you can see, as we've talked about in the past, 69.2% of all your revenue is coming from your real estate tax and your personal property tax, and tax on commercial real estate or property as well. That's a very large proportion. That is really symptomatic of the fact that we don't have businesses here. We don't have a B-poll tax or anything like that. Our sales tax is not benefiting by some large retailer or anything like that. Some other localities may. You can see when you look at general property tax and the other, which is the sales, et cetera, that's really a huge part of your revenue is coming from the sales tax, meals and lodging tax, and then the general and real estate personal property tax. Not a lot you can do about that. You can maybe grow this other local pie slice a little bit and reduce the general property a little bit. If you say raised your sales tax, your meals tax and lodging tax to 6 and 6, and then maybe dropped your real estate tax down a penny or something like that. You can make those trade-offs, trying to capture more out of county dollars as opposed to dollars that are guaranteed to come from your citizens because they own property. Looking, and a lot of these slides are busy, but I did it that way as a takeaway, so you can look at this later. As I've done over the last couple of years, I've tracked what was requested in those documents that came to me and what made it into my proposed budget. In FY20, there was a $428,000 difference. So this year, we're down to $179,000. So those budget holders are starting to get the idea that if they send me budgets requests that are out of whack, it's not going to make it through anyway. So they're truing those up.
And the 400 you mentioned is the gap between
Requested and proposed.
and it's the $1.065 million difference minus the additional revenue projection. Is that?
No, if you look at the very bottom, your detailed, the last page, of your detailed budget, the very bottom of the column of requested, not your presentation, but the 11 by 17 document. I've summed up the entire columns of requested budgets and the entire column of what was proposed and just did the simple subtraction. So it's at the very bottom of the page 22, and you'll see that 179,303. So within this general fund expenditure, you have the cost for the 5% raise. I say that there are limited exceptions to that, and that I am recommending a larger raise for the registrar based on the significant increase in revenue from the state for that position. And having those discussions with the registrar in the past, I made it clear that the problem was not our local share, it was the amount that was coming from the state. And so the state has stepped up and increased funding. And so this also recognizes that with a raise, and you can see those details in the detailed sheet. I noted that the board contingency has a lump sum to implement the classification compensation study, including developing very clear career ladders in our constitutional officer departments rather than the longevity incentive program. And that's set at $115,000 right now. I think that'll mostly do it. Note later on, if it's not enough, we can decide when to start that, whether we want to do it partway this year or not do everything we want to do and start at the beginning of the fiscal year, or do everything we want to do and start it later in the fiscal year. Now, looking at these expenditure differences between FY 20, 21, 22, the difference column is between 21 and 22. And you look at general government administration, and that function includes the Board of Supervisors, County Administrator, and Registrar, and a few others. You see a significant decrease from 21 to 22. That is largely due to CARES Act, because we parked most of the CARES Act money in the board contingency budget and spend it out of there. And we're not doing that in 22. So you see that reduction. On the contrary, you see public safety, which is showing a $548,000 increase. And you can see you've got one new deputy, you've got the full-time emergency services coordinator, emergency management coordinator, you have the paid EMS, and you've got a relocation of the fire and rescue, For Life, and aid to localities moving into that budget, which is causing that number to increase significantly one year to another. It's a lot to do with new positions and then shifting from one location in the budget to another. Not many huge changes in the rest, other than the transfer to other funds. And there you have the larger increase for the schools and a larger increase for capital fund because it includes $150,000 for the paid EMS. Now, if you look at the schools, and you were at the presentation last night, Dr. Grimsley said, I think the increase was $230,000, but remember, $185,000 of that, it was really budgeted last year, but then held back and held in your contingency. And so of that 231, 185 was already in last year's budget before we stepped back and said, wait a minute, COVID's coming, we better really be conservative. So it's not quite as large as it may seem, the school's requested increase, which is another reason why these extra dollars that are being proposed this year aren't requiring a large tax increase, because they were in the budget. Much of it was in the budget last year, just held back to be conservative. And then looking at the general fund expenditures by function over time, you can see some of those changes in FY21. The growth of the function 1 due to the CARES money, and then reduction back down. And relative to all the others in the stack graph, you can see how things lay out. So last year we talked a lot about the health insurance programs. I'm not recommending any change in that, and of course signaled that in an earlier meeting. The biggest part of this whole budget relative to human resources is the 5% COLA that is partially funded by the state. The math works out to about 42% being funded by the state. And that is because two things. One, not nearly all of our employees are state responsible. Only some of our constitutional officer employees are state responsible. Some sheriff's office, some treasurer's office. And then at that, only some of their salary is. And at that, even the state doesn't pay the entire salary for any of our employees. We pay them an amount on top of that so that we can attract qualified candidates. So at the end of the day, when this General Assembly says they're going to give us a 5% raise, that means they're going to give us 42% of the 5% raise. We're going to give that raise on a top line salary number for our staff. That's better than schools, which is closer to 70% from the state. As I noted, the health insurance decreased, and I'm just sharing that savings between the county and the staff the same way we shared the increase with the county and the staff last year and the last several years. And then the $115,000 for Baker Tilly. I communicated with each constitutional officer, except for the Commonwealth Attorney, who really doesn't have the staff to do a career liner. And they've agreed to work with Baker Tilly to do that. Baker Tilly's agreed to work with us to expand the work they've already done to include more defined career ladders. I already noted the timing. As I noted last year, it's important for the board to keep track of how many positions we have in which department. Just because somebody has salary money available doesn't mean that they can just hire anybody they want, because the fringes that go along with those can be very expensive. So tracking what we've done in the past, you can see this table updated to show the one extra deputy in the sheriff's office. Let's give you another idea on why it's 42% as well. You can see in the sheriff's office, there's 14 positions that are partially funded by the state out of their entirety of their staff. And for example, the treasurer shows 3 that are authorized by the state, but they really only pay for like 1 1/10. You can see on the emergency services management line, the elevation of the part-time employee to a full-time emergency services coordinator, and then about 7 part-time. It could be more, but assuming around 24 hours per week per employee, you would require exactly 7, but then they fluctuate more or less than that. Looking over the sheriff budget quickly, as I have in the past, because that is one of our larger departments and it typically is not fully staffed through the year just due to normal turnover, I am taking a vacancy credit to help balance the budget, same as I've done in the past. And it's about assuming that her department will end up being understaffed by at least 1 person for 4 months out of the year. Ems. So then you can see also she's requested 2 vehicles again, and I believe that's definitely needed this year after the year she's had, and that's included in capital using our pay-go dollars. We're looking at our staffing, same chart I've provided in the past. See the blue vertical bars show her actual staffing on each payroll cycle every other week, and then the red line being her full employment. So over the last several years, there are limited periods of time when that department's been at full employment, and I think taking that vacancy credit is reasonable, noting that it reduces some expenditure, but it also reduces revenue too. The state doesn't give us revenue when we don't have the employee in the position. It's not as much of a savings as we might like, but it does recognize the history here. Okay. In the general fund, in the emergency services, we've had the emergency services department, which is 03605 in your detailed budget. That included all the maintenance costs for the radio system. I've broken that maintenance out for the radio system operation maintenance to be its own department, so we can track that separately. And so it doesn't muddy the water for what expenditures are happening in emergency services by themselves. So in your detailed document, you'll see a new department, Public Safety Radio O&M. So the emergency services now includes funding for paid EMS at a single ALS provider, $24 an hour, 24/7, 365, which comes out to a little less than 211,000. That's just rounded. And then, as I noted earlier, that's 68.5 of a lump sum that would have to cover multiple things, from training to supplies to all sorts of things. And as we get new employees in, they would be defining that budget. If it's short a little bit, it'd probably be short on a one-time need, and we could pull from the general fund balance to supplement that and then look to correct it going forward. I noted earlier the 4 for Life grant funding, which is like $9,000 a year, and the aid to localities fire funding, which is $30,000 a year. They were directed over the last several years into the fire service fund. That's probably not appropriate because the fire service fund is set up to clearly separate the revenue and expenditures that are being paid for by the fire levy tax, because we need to safeguard that fire levy tax and make sure it's only spent for those things. So it really should only be comprised of that fire levy tax revenue and expenditures. So pulling that out, just sliding it over into the general fund. It's really an accounting thing, because our practice has been to simply pull this revenue in and then push it right out to the departments. Divide the 9,000 for the 4 for Life by 6, and then divide the 30,000 by 6 for our 6 EMS companies and our 6 fire companies. And I noted that has the recurring transfer. School fund transfer of $8,845,964 that fully funds the superintendent and school board's request. That's based on an ADM of 765, includes the 5% COLA and a compression correction. She's actually sure the wording she used. Schools really like to talk about how this 5% is some sort of mandate. It's not a mandate, but if you want that revenue, you have to use it for raises. So that 17% or so, we might as well take it and use it for that purpose, because our neighbors are probably going to do that because they're not subject to our LCI. They're getting a lot better bang for their buck than we do. So if we can get it a little bit, that helps us keep up with them and attract qualified staff.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Curry. I know that's always challenging to differentiate what's mandated versus what's not mandated.
Yeah.
I know it was presented a certain way previously, so I really appreciate that clarification.
Really good news is that starting last year, maybe the year before, I think it was last year, the state is funding $200,000 a year to our schools for their operating their capital needs. And so, as Dr. Grimsley showed last night and Dr. Bolt during our joint meeting, that $200,000 a year, along with their new COVID funding, the SR2 funding, satisfies all of their projected capital for the next 5 years. So they're not requesting any transfer of pay-go dollars of any capital need from the county, allowing the board to focus capital dollars on our needs. And then where the capital needs, pay-go needs aren't evident, can be shifted to an operational need. Just goes with note, this handshake agreement many years ago that the VPSA 2011 Series B bond, we don't technically budget for it in the county budget. Well, we do, but it's set up right now as being backed up by a $150,000 reservation on the general fund balance. And we fully expect not to spend that $150,000. And it's expected that at the end of the fiscal year, the schools win the year with at least $150,000 unspent each year. And so it's really just a protection in case that doesn't happen. You'll see in the general fund balance, the use of general fund balance, you'll see that that number includes $150,000 there. It also includes $100,000 for your contingency, which we generally expect not to use, but we have it there. Even if we use a little, even if you reserve it during the year, it's very likely by the time we get to the end of the year, we don't make the transfers because there's enough money in your general fund somewhere that we can transfer those operational dollars. And then we talked at the joint meeting about this elephant of declining staff enrollment, or declining student enrollment, and the per pupil expenditures and the transfer over time. I spent a little bit of time to look into that, and it turns out that we're really pretty even over time on our per pupil costs when you adjust things for CPI. So the bottom of this stack bar chart, the blue is local funds. I've highlighted the $9,000 per pupil grid line there. And you can see in 2011, it was a little bit more than 9,000. In 2021, it's a little bit more than 9,000. So even though our enrollment has declined, and it looks like, well, we're still spending $9 million, you just can't buy a loaf of bread for the same $9 million. So when you put those two things together, it's pretty level. So that's, I thought that was interesting.
One question that came to mind, it looks like this caps out at $14,000 per pupil. I was just curious, what were your numerator and denominator assumptions for?
So these are in adjusted to 2011 dollars through the CPIW. And it's whole expenditures in each of one of these categories: local, state, federal, and then miscellaneous, which is their local grants, path, et cetera. And you can see that purple bar has grown over the last few years.
This is not linked at all to the overall balanced budget summary page 6, where
no, this is drilling into really
CPI.
This is drilling into school data that is more detailed than we budget. This is digging into their budget and looking at their revenue that we have, that is in our budgets. If you look at the school revenue, and you'll see a line for state revenue, you see a line for federal revenue, you'll see the line for the local transfer, and you'll see the other miscellaneous. So these are those portions. But then when you adjust it back for CPI, after dividing by the ADM for each year, and I can get you the data if you want to look at the data more
Is this
closely.
a new chart? Have you provided this in your?
Have not, and this was, the question came up at the joint meeting, and I thought, it's an interesting question. I wonder what the data shows.
It's very interesting. Thank you for working through this data.
And I have to say, the schools helped me by sharing data and working together.
Very good.
Ask a lot of questions about what happened in 2014. And it seems to be a bit of an outlier. I'm guessing that we got more state and federal money and was able to, or more federal and miscellaneous money, and that allowed us to reduce the local expenditure. So we'd have to go back to that 2014 budget and see why that is a bit of an outlier on the local side.
I think we just got harder on that year and they figured it out.
Could be. Just before this period, 2008, 2009, that was That was really the hard time for local governments in Virginia. Library fund, very similar to what we've talked about before. However, this year, as evidenced by the interest revenue that the county is receiving, the library likewise is not receiving a whole lot of interest revenue on their $1.67 million, whatever it is. And so this year finally took the step to completely eliminate the use of investment interest for operating needs at the library. And so the Code of Virginia requires the board to fund reasonable operation and maintenance costs. And over the last several years, the library has helped with that by using the interest from their invested income to offset a little bit of that. This year, we don't do that. And the only use of investment income is to offset their capital needs, which in this case is their expansion, renovation, design services. The state revenue is growing just a little bit over last year. And after the dust settles with the state budget, maybe we'll see it grows more. If it does, our requirements will drop a little bit. Although 75% of that state revenue has to go to buy books. The Fire Services Fund, we've touched on this, and I want to get too in the weeds. No change in the tax rates. No need to pull from the fire service fund balance, which we have over the last several years to pay for the radio system capital that's been delayed and delayed and delayed. Finally, that'll be behind us and won't make its way into FY22. There is a fund balance available if we needed one-time costs in the fire service fund. Say if there was a true emergency need among the fire companies for repair to one of their critical pieces of apparatus, the board could pull from that fund balance to fund it. We all know that the services agreement requires the board to aspire to fund 100% within the limits of prudent budgetary priorities. And this budget does that. The amount that was passed along from the fire levy board is $616,129 for the 7 companies. I did not receive a budget from the Fire and Rescue Association. It didn't make it through the fire levy board. And so I budgeted the same amount as was budgeted last year for that. I believe that number is conservative because at a recent association meeting months ago, it was revealed that they have a fairly healthy fund balance now. So the only way that the association can build a fund balance is by having more revenue than expenses, and the only revenue they get is from us. So we must be giving them plenty. So until they provide a budget that shows that they what exactly they need, it's a good placeholder. My budget includes a continuation of funding for the Chester Gap Volunteer Fire Department EMS program. The agreement that the board entered into with Chester Gap and the parallel agreement that Chester Gap has with Warren County calls for $5,000 a month up to. And so I'm bumping that to $5,500 a month just because I've seen their expenses over time. And sometimes they were over $5,000 because they were training people and we only paid them the $5,000. So that's included out of the fire service fund revenue. The apparatus replacement, like we've done before, and I said earlier, $60,000. That's $10,000 per company. And company 7 has declined using that, and I think that's recognizing that there are 2 Sperryville agencies, and they just thought that'll resolve any concern that Sperryville was getting more than maybe their fair share. And then maybe for the 5th time in this presentation, that's $50,000 being sent over to the general fund. You can see the detailed budget here. Up on the top is the revenue and the bottom is expenditure. And now the revenue lines consist solely of 2 things: for the real property tax and the personal property tax. And those are the separate levies that the board applies. There's some conversation earlier this year that the board could do away with a levy tax and just do it all in the general fund. And you could do that. You can see the 4 for Life and the State Fire Fund. Those are no longer shown in FY22 where they were in FY21. And they just now land in the general fund. And the 277 that is was a use of fire service fund balance in FY21. That's for our Harris radio costs. That will not show up next year because it'll be fully paid out. On the expenditure side, you can see the Fire Rescue Association, and then the amount for the companies plus the Chester Gap requirement. That's the 682, $60,000 for the apparatus replacement, $10,000 for your audits. And then that leaves just a very small amount of contingency in the 50,000 headed over to the general fund. So $1,093,800 coming in, $1,093,800 going out. Debt service fund, I've had the same slide the last couple of years. I actually tweaked these numbers just a little bit. Just looking back at the debt schedules and the bank fee that we get. But you can see over the next couple of years, we're going to be shedding debt service after this fiscal year, FY22. This is the last payment for the 2011 Series B. And you'll have a significant decrease in FY23, dropping from 369 down to 207. So that's good. I've been trying to protect those debt service dollars by applying those to your pay-go capital so that you can continue to use them for a capital-based need, or when the time arises to reapply them to debt service for some future project without having to go back to the taxpayers and say, hey, we're going to get a bond and we need more money from you. If we protect these dollars, then those dollars should be available to pay for that debt service. And if you can hold off till 26, then that gives you even more to do that with. And speaking of that, we get to the capital fund, real busy slide. But just a reminder that this 5-year CIP, the first year is budgeted in this budget in some way or form, whether it's general fund balance dollars, grant dollars, or these recurring pay-go dollars. The remaining years of the CIP are for planning and to get an idea of what's coming down the pike. This year, I'm showing the pay-go budget at 235. There's an asterisk there, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. That is recurring revenue. We noted that the school's capital is now fully funded by state revenue. That's great. The facility conditions and space needs study, I'm still showing that at $300,000 a year. For all practical purposes, that's a placeholder as we continue to learn from the various studies what we need to do locally. If more is needed, the board could appropriate more from the fund balance. All that is from the fund balance to begin with, so it's really just a placeholder there. An open-ended question, as I noted, do we want to try to schedule new debt service supported capital building program to align with our expiring debt service? So on the next page, you'll see where I've dropped in that debt service cost along with the CIP, and you can see how that times out. $150,000 for the paid EMS. We talked about that. The NG 911 project has been delayed for various reasons, one of which is everybody is having to upgrade their call handling equipment right now, and there are very few providers of that equipment. So it looks like that project that we first budgeted in 20 is made it into 21. Probably all that project will happen in 22. That is, of that $260,000 budgeted project, $210,000 is revenue from the state. So that's moving along but slowly. A lot of the project is done. If you remember, that was actually $740,000 project. Most of it was paid directly by the state. So that includes new fiber routes to the dispatch center from 2 different directions by 2 different providers to make sure we had fully diverse fiber connections for this next generation 911. All that's done right now, waiting for the new equipment. Talked last year about the public safety radio coverage from the new L3 Harris system. We didn't know what it was going to be because we weren't live yet. We are live now, and this new system has much improved coverage. Not perfect. It's very surprising to me how good the coverage is for us not having a single transmission site in our county for this 800 megahertz system. We are wrapped in Culpeper and Fauquier, and all those sites power up and provide coverage. But with a hilly terrain, there are areas that for portable coverage, certainly in a building, it just doesn't exist. So the board could at some point in time add sites in the county. Had a quick proposal pulled together from Harris a year or two ago that showed to be $670,000 then to add a site at Sperryville in Washington. That would, and that's very preliminary, but that would significantly increase your coverage in this area, provide in-building coverage in areas where you have the highest density structures like your schools and your courthouse and things like that. It may make sense at some point in time. I'm still showing that in and out year next year. If we really want to go down that road, it'll take a lot more studying to figure that out.
Mr. Kirk, can you refresh my memory? When did the Harris system go live?
I'm terrible with relative dates.
Me too, that's why I'm asking. I'm just trying to remember if with the leaf out in the next few weeks.
The testing was done during full leaf out.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
So
it
we're on
was-
through that.
It had to wait for that to happen.
Very good.
And then most people don't completely understand that we actually have two radio systems. We have the 800 megahertz system that has the transmit and receive to the radios in the cars and the portables on the hips of our public safety providers. We also have the VHF system that provides signals to the pagers that our volunteers wear on their hips, so they are alerted. The coverage from that system appears to be inadequate in the northern part of the county. That's a 5-site system. It uses the Sperryville Tower, the Washington Tower, the tower at the Amesville Fire Department, Rixieville, and then the Culpeper landfill. So most of the county is really well covered. But if you can kind of envision the county, the Washington Tower and the Amesville Tower are the closest to Flint Hill and north. And there's some areas just around Flint Hill and just north of Flint Hill that are shaded pretty well by some mountains. I've started the dialogue with Harris and with Comcast to look at the costs to add another site, single site, somewhere in the northern part of the county. Could be Chester Gap, could be Huntley at that silo location where Comcast is already located. Not sure, but I don't have those numbers yet. So with that, we go into this detailed budget, which is really small. But all those items are stacked in this FY22 column that we just talked about that are happening. This top row is the county building upgrades pursuant to study. And as I noted, that's $300,000 per year. It's shown until FY25, and then just a question. So if you look at the very bottom, the scheduled debt service is also shown. And in FY25, that's your last debt service year. So you could enter into the bond market in 25 with your first debt payment due in 26, with a large capital program in 25, and kind of not skip a beat on your debt service payments and take advantage of the fact that you're all your debt service would be done by 25. We can look at also what happens if we can keep the capacity from the full 369 of your debt service this year, and it drops $150,000 next year. You may have a window to do something a little bit earlier. There's a lot of work that's happening right now in the building committee and with your consultants to figure out what is the best way to go about adding capacity or fixing your buildings, and so that is going to be working out the rest of this several months for sure. And that is going to drive that big question. When do we take that next big step? And what is that next big step? But in the intervening years, there are those envelope type improvements that need to be done. And your fund balance is very healthy. And it could be taxed much more than I'm showing here, but this is a placeholder, as I've said. And these roofs that were separated out for the courthouse and the admin building and the visitor center, new admin building. Just didn't program those at all in this table and just said, we'll allow that overall study to drive what should happen and when. And so we'll budget the big bucket of $300,000. And as that needs to be parsed off to smaller projects, allow that to be, whether it's masonry or roof or whatever is the highest recommended project is pursuant to the committee or your consultant to drive those decisions. If 300,000 is not enough, then the committee can come to you with a recommendation to pull more from the fund balance, which is more than adequate right now to accommodate that. And that fund balance could also help with bridging a year of debt service if you wanted to do a project a little bit earlier. You have a lot of money in the bank and the savings account. You could say, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get this started now. I know I'm going to have to pay my new bond debt service next year, even though I already have debt service. It's more than I was expecting, but you can bridge a year using your savings account to get that done earlier, quicker. Rolling down, you can see, well, the reassessment project is not technically a capital project. I've been showing it here in this table because I am capturing those dollars out of your pay-go amount so that they're protected for the next year. So this 2-year cost that we've had at 90,000, 92,000 this year and 105 next year. Those dollars would be available for some other capital need in the following year because they're not just coming out of the savings account, they're recurring dollars. They could be put to work in some other use next year. So that's why I'm showing them here, even though they're not technically capital dollars, they're not funded out of the capital fund, they are funded in the general fund, in the Board of Assessors account. I'm still showing the $35,000 as internal GIS startup costs to add parcel fabric and zoning for staff use, not public facing. It's certainly something the board would want to talk about. That will also help in broadband in other areas, significantly help the commissioner revenue. $25,000 for county vehicles. That's the ENS inspector vehicle. And I'm showing that again out in the beyond, the 50,000 for the beyond. Sometime after 2026 will be time to replace our other vehicles that we just replaced a couple years ago. And I'm also showing $200,000 in the beyond column for reassessment, knowing that every 6 years we have to go through that process. Rolling down, you can see the NG 911 project. That's a $260,000 project, of which $210,000 is state revenue. Sheriff vehicles two at $35,000 each. And I'm showing the pending in either FY21 or in FY22 for VHF system improvements. We'll see when we can get some information on that. If something comes together in FY21, I'll probably bring a recommendation to the board, and the board could decide to move forward on that in 21 by making appropriation, or it could slide off into 22. Schools on the bottom and all zeros across the board. So we like to see that. And then just highlighting again the debt service in 26, nothing. So that's a lot of information. All of the details are in the detailed sheet posted to board docs as well as in front of you. There are now several work sessions scheduled, one more than last year. The next is on March 15th. There is a separate body meeting that night, the Broadband Authority, not you. And so there is a work session scheduled for that day. I've scheduled most of the work sessions in this space. I think it's a little easier than the library, which is a smaller room. There's one day, I think it's the 24th, that's in the library. We may not need all those days, but we may. If you heard the school board last night, they adjusted their schedule last night to have a budget meeting on April 5th, which is your regular meeting day. That is really the last opportunity to make any changes to the budget that will be advertised for public hearing, because the public hearing ad must go into the paper the next day. Plan to schedule the board's evening session at the elementary school that night, and you can work through your normal meeting requirements. And then if the school board is needed to help shape the overall budget at that time, you'll be able to have that conversation without running into an issue with 1 or 2 or 3 school board members being there and being worried about having conversations relative to FOIA. But that is absolutely critical that by the end of the day on that April 5th, I need to know precisely what needs to go in the paper on the 6th. And we should have it really well shaped out before then. Making those last minute changes will be tricky. So I'm happy to take any questions from the board. I don't expect there to be a ton, but I've lived these numbers for a few days now, so I'm pretty familiar with them. Happy to answer those questions, or we can just hold off until the 15th.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Curry, for drawing together a lot of these shifting factors, that we're having to deal with, including the increases, that we've been wanting to, and also the classification that we've been wanting to take on from Baker Tilly, working in the additional request for a sheriff's deputy and the paid EMS volunteers. I know it's a lot of challenging factors to work into the budget, and to be able to do it without taking on any increases is really wonderful. And I don't know how the rest of the board feels. I'm curious to see if any of the stakeholders requested meetings with us. I know that's affected our path forward in the past. And also, I just want to say up front, I think it's got all the factors in the budget that we requested and are looking for. And if we could adopt it on an abbreviated schedule at the first opportunity this year, I think that would be a really smart way forward, to take decisive action and move on to other things. So, but I would like to know if anybody in particular requested to speak to us.
At this point, they don't know what's in the budget, other than those who are listening right now or are watching. So over the next week or so, we may hear from some of those budget holders. For the most part, I think the requests were satisfied. So we'll, I'll let you know and let them know that it's a two-way street. The board may want to talk to different budget holders, and different budget holders may want to talk to the board, and both opportunities are available in the upcoming meetings.
I believe our CRFA representatives will want to speak to the board, and I did direct them to the work session dates.
Yeah, they requested $14,000, and I held to the $12,000 a year right now.
So by the 15th, we would know whether we want to bring somebody in, or we would know if anyone is scheduled to speak with us.
You wouldn't have to know. We may, in past years, we've worked through the detailed budget pretty much line by line, just so you could understand some of the intricacies of that. And as you go through those line by line, perhaps on the 15th or the 22nd, it may jog a question that you may want to send off to one of the budget holders, that either that has to be answered in person or in some written form. But the earlier the better, certainly. And any questions you have outside of the meeting, just go ahead and send them or give me a call.
I've just got a few, and you don't have to, if any of these take more than 5 seconds to just clear up, we can talk about it later. I was just curious, you went pretty quickly through the insurance premium reduction of 1%. Just want to understand that better. I just have 10 questions.
So I don't know about 5 seconds, but the way that works is we pay 100% of the employee only.
Mhm.
So that dropped from 766 to like 752.
Okay.
And then we've shared 50-50 that the increase for the dependent coverage. And so we've shared that back in revenue. So our cost went down for the dependent coverage, and their cost went down for the dependent coverage.
All right. The 115,000 contingency for the career ladders, where did that number originate? What is it tied to specifically?
That's baked into the Baker Tilly study, which you haven't seen. I recognize that it's still draft, and I've been protecting it. It still needs some work with my recent discussions with the constitutional officers on career ladders. But there are several options in that that document to implement the compensation plan. And some of those aligned with the cost for a overall COLA to make it more palatable to all staff, because there's haves and have-nots when you do that compensation study. Not everybody gets the same raise because you're fixing things. But because we're in a year with a COLA, that takes some pressure off of that, and why it's a little bit less than what I suggested last year.
Okay, and then you mentioned that Baker Tilly is going to work with the constitutional officers trying to define these career ladders. Is that work and the time spent on that already embedded within our existing retainer agreement, or will we incur additional costs for Baker Tilly to work with them?
They've agreed to do it at no additional cost.
Great. On the 40,000 tourism related revenue, that's tied to the increase from 2 to 4%. I guess I'm thinking of it kind of like CARES Act money in a way. I assume it's restricted and somebody would watch how we use it. How will we know how we may use that 40,000?
Well, yeah, Miss Nick and I discussed that a little bit today and how we need to track that, because it's not exactly $40,000. That's an estimate, right? And so there's probably a little bit different tracking on the revenue side with the different codes that she uses for that revenue that comes in. But you have a department all set off to itself in the budget, which is right near the end of the general fund. And I think that totals 41,000 right now, or 41,005 or something like that. And that includes the salaries for our tourism staff, the contribution to Business of Rappahannock, contribution for the Civil War trails, things like that. They're historical society, which are clearly in that realm. So
are we subject to some outside verification or
yeah, I don't think really, but if tourism industry and the community felt that it wasn't being handled right, they probably would come forward. We'll track it as closely as possible.
150,000 capital needs for paying EMS, just generally, what is the origin of that figure? What is it tied to?
It's it's a bucket that I know is big enough.
Okay. All right. School fund and cafeteria fund in combination hit about $14 million, and I was still struggling to tie that in some way to the graph that you prepared so thoughtfully, because at the top of your graph it shows per student spending about 14,000, but if you take 14 million and divide it by student enrollment, just rough number 800, comes out more like 17,000. I don't know how you reconcile those two. Or
well, one FY22 is not shown on the chart in the presentation, so I haven't looked at 22, and 22 doesn't exist quite yet until May.
Okay.
But 21, I'll send you the document, but you have to remember it's $2,011, right? So it's reduced by a significant factor of the stacked CPI over those 10 years.
So it's not like it's theoretical.
You could do that on the 2011 number. You couldn't do it on the 2021 number.
Got it. Looks like you're proposing a $1.065 million increase over last year in the overall budget. Page 13 shows a revenue increase of $669,000, which means about a $400,000 gap. How are we covering that gap? And am I missing something there?
I'm sure you're not missing anything, but there's probably an explanation. What is it?
So you've got an increase of just about $1,065,000.
Page 13 is the general fund only,
Okay.
as opposed to the overall that you would see in that first chart. So there's, for example, the SR2 funds never go through the general fund. Those grant funds for the schools are going straight into the school fund.
Okay.
That's 500 and some odd thousand right there.
All right. So it's apples and oranges. Sorry about that. Page 11, very quickly. There's about a $200,000 difference between requested and proposed. And I assume the detail of what you're cutting is in the. Yeah,
so you'll see in the detail, there's a column that shows requests for every single budget line.
Okay,
whether
so
it's,
we should be able to roll up to the $200,000.
you won't be able to count how many pencils, but you'll know the difference in office supplies.
Almost done. The $50,000 transfer, and I think I figured it out. So this, I guess my question is mechanically, why are we doing it this way? It looks like money is going to the fire service fund and you're pulling it out and pulling it back into the general fund. Why is that?
Well, you have to balance the budget. The expenses for the paid EMS are eligible to use the fire service fund and fire levy tax dollars. We
Okay.
passed that ordinance. The general fund doesn't balance without it,
Okay.
and with it, it does.
Got it. Bond market, if we enter the bond market in 2025, just assuming interest rates remain the same for a while, and we wanted to borrow for building renovation as one example, at our current level of debt service, how much do you think we could borrow?
Yeah, I don't have that at the tip of my tongue. Shared that in the past. I want to say 10 million was like $300,000 on 20-year money, but I'd have to check that.
Okay, I'll follow up with you on that. And then finally, I always struggle. What's your methodology other than off the top of your head when you talk about fund balance and being comfortable with our fund balance?
Yeah, so when you look at the fund balance number, and I don't find it right. We look at the general fund revenue. General fund balance, you're showing 728,505. One of the reasons why it's an odd number is the budget is actually out of balance right now with a little too much revenue. And so that number is reduced, but it's netted out on that line item. There'll be several puts and takes between now and when the budget's adopted. That 728, that's made up of the $150,000 reservation for that one bond payment, which is really not going to be spent. $100,000 for your contingency, which really shouldn't be spent. So that's 250,000 of that 728 is not going to be spent. Another 300,000 of that is for the building general fund. 150 is for your EMS, and then 50 is for the grant match for the NG911.
Okay.
So I don't have any concerns with that at all. When you look at your cash graph every month,
Yep.
and you see the trough of that cash graph, we're somewhere around $3 million in the trough, and so we have plenty of cash to put to work and invest. Plus, we know every year we go. This year alone, we're receiving more revenue than we anticipated, which is only adding to that fund balance, right?
Can we renew this promotion of the early payment of
Oh, of course,
property taxes?
absolutely.
I mean,
That's the plan. You know, a lot of localities bill twice a year. They have a much tighter time frame to do that. You got to get the bills out quick because they're due right away. They're due in June. And we don't have that. Our bills aren't due to December. There's no reason why we can't get it done.
I was just telling somebody the other day, the whole monthly debit program, a lot of people don't know about. Maybe the treasurer can get the word out about that again.
Yeah, she can. So as far as the cash flow really goes to how much of the money in the bank that you can put to work.
Yeah.
If we can accelerate cash flow, that helps you put those dollars to work.
Yeah, but with interest being so low, it's not working very hard.
Right. No,
So, but 10 years ago, at least for 1 year, maybe for 2 years, but at least for 1 year, included in the tax bill was another form that asked people if they wanted to donate extra money, and they could check for the school or the sheriff or whatever, or just put it in the general fund. We could do that. It raised quite a bit of money.
really.
And all we had to do was put one more slip of paper in the envelope.
That's interesting.
And I think it'd be fun to try to do that again. There are plenty of people that are here that have extra cash, and they may actually chip in.
Yeah, and I would imagine that may be a stronger message if it were directed to a particular purpose, whether it be a
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people.
public safety
a lot of
or
people
something
put
like
it
that.
Toward the school. But,
School,
some
yeah.
put it toward the sheriff's office, and then some just said spend it wisely. But I forget how much. Remember, Ron, how much came in? It was quite a bit.
I've always heard of people saying that you're always welcome to pay more. I've never actually heard of somebody asking for people to go ahead and do it.
Well, there was a form, and
Yeah.
so they could check where it would be spent if they thought something was important, or
Yeah.
the food pantry, or you name it, and we could just add that money. Into
Yeah.
the line item. It wouldn't hardly cost anything to do it, so over time.
Probably not. We just have to make sure doing everything the way we need to, and they're safeguarding those dollars when they can come in and actually is used for those purposes.
Well, the other thing that I think we talked about frequently is including a request for volunteers for fire and rescue in any mailings that we do, so it would be an opportunity to tie that to that as well.
I did note in this presentation, I still have not taken any credit for reduced trash going to Amosville. And I have not taken any credit for reduced leachate costs at Amosville. I feel fairly certain that will be resolved sometime between now and the middle of 22. Our permits into the state for the leachate thing. And we've talked a little bit about how we're going to handle the Culpeper County citizens. So if we accomplish those goals, it'll just put us in a better position on the budget, and those dollars can be put to use somewhere else.
Thanks, Ward.
Yes. Any other questions? Thank you very much. I like how you walk us through everything. It makes much more sense that way. Next on the agenda is, I assume we just did the schedule reminder. So
Well, you probably just did the budget work session and the schedule reminder for the last slide. So
So public comment. I will open this to public comment. Same rules apply. If you have anything to say, please raise your hand. Go up to the mic. Tell us what district you're in.
Good evening, David Koenig from Stonewall Hawthorne District. I want to commend Mr. Curry for a really good presentation, and it's nice to hear that the taxes aren't going to go up and we're going to be able to fund a lot of things without raising the taxes. But I did want to make a suggestion to the board about the Planning Commission, and I've done this before some years ago, and I just want to relate real quickly an incident that happened about a month or two ago. Back long ago in the 1980s, there were 3 Daves involved in zoning and planning: myself, Mr. Thornhill, and Mr. Fannin. And Mr. Fannin moved away from the area, but he's sort of back in the area. And so Mr. Thornhill and I went to visit him. And we were reminiscing about old times. And one time, Mr. Fannin got in, I don't know, some kind of a dispute about something or another, and there was a move afoot to remove him. I think Mr. Fraser will remember, to remove him from the Planning Commission. And as most of you know, Mr. Fannin's from the family that owns Fannin Oil Company down in Alexandria. So I jokingly said to him, well, Dave, if you're really in trouble, I'll write a letter to the editor and tell him not to take you off the Planning Commission because you need the money. And so we laughed about that. This was just a few weeks ago. And he said, what are they paying the planning commissioners now? And I said, same thing, Dave, $20. And it's been $20 since 1966. These people, as you know, Mr. Whitson, especially, you're on it now, do a tremendous amount of work for the county. I like to think of them as kind of the brain trust of the county that's looking to the future. And, you know, $20 a meeting hardly pays for the gas these days for them to come. And so I know it's a kind of a symbolic thing. They're all serving not for the money, but still, it would be a nice thing to do to show the board's appreciation. And I don't think it would put a big dent in the budget, but I really think that $20, I mean, if you're gonna only give them $20, maybe you just should dispense with giving them anything, because it's kind of an insulting amount of money, considering the work that is expected of them to do. And analyze things, think about things, draft things sometimes, come to meetings. And, you know, it's nice to get the little check at the end of the year. But anyway, I would ask you to consider that. Thank you.
maybe, well, you just said that. I think it's a little bit higher than 20, but what, that was 35. But one thing I did include in the budget that you'll see when you get to the details, the Planning Commission asked for $10,000 for consultant support or something. Actually increased that to $20,000. And then there's a heavy lift over the next year. Not sure who would provide those services, but that is in the budget that's before you.
All right, anybody else for public comment? Yes, sir, Mr.
Gary Hampton. This is my second night of hearing budget reports, and I just want to say, as a citizen, we are fortunate in Rappahannock. These are two of the best presentations I've heard of a public budget. It's transparent, it's complete, it's dense, but you can follow it. I can follow it, which means most people, if they paid attention, could follow it. And I just appreciate the fact of the effort that goes into these budgets to try and give us the best services that we can possibly have in the county without increasing taxes, trying to get as close as we can to always improving things as costs go up. I believe the county is better than it was when I moved here 8 years ago. And that's a testament to the leadership of the boards and also to the administrators who we have working now together to bring us these results. I just want to express my appreciation to the administrator, but also to the board of supervisors for having such a good budget process that's good, getting us good results without just the automatic sense that, well, things cost 5% more, 3%, let's just increase the taxes. No, it's I don't know, it's zero-based budgeting, but it comes close, where every single expenditure is studied. And I believe we're getting, I don't see much fat and I don't see much waste. And as a taxpayer, I appreciate that. I just think that we're in a pretty good place right now. For the quality of life, the improvements, the challenges of the last couple of years, I believe that the public fund, whether it's the school budget or this side of the house, being good stewards with good results. So that's my appreciation. I do have one question. If the current fiscal year ends up in a surplus, does the county recognize it with a carry forward? I didn't see it as a revenue item. Or what? How do you account for a budget surplus?
Well, ultimately, it falls to the fund balance and is available for future use.
So it doesn't show up as an automatic carryover to the next fiscal year. It's a separate, you pull that out.
Correct.
And so somewhere there's a fund balance that's uses to balance deficits and surpluses.
Yeah, it's all held in our bank.
All right.
We generally wouldn't know what that number is until.
No, right, yeah, it takes a while to roll that one out, but no, I was just, in many budgets, they estimate what they think they might have as a surplus, and it shows up as a revenue for next year as a carry forward. Just want to know where it went, and now I know.
Yeah, so every year we do an audit,
Right.
Comprehensive annual financial report, usually presentation to the board in December, and it goes through that entire process and identifies what that surplus is.
Well, I didn't think you were taking it home. So
It's gonna go to the planning.
I didn't think that was going to happen either, but thank you. That answers that question.
Thank you.
We don't.
Mr. Glenn?
Hard to get seats once they get.
Hayes Glennie, Jackson District. First thing, I want to commend Mr. Curry for, again, an excellent budget presentation. The difference between now and when I first started watching the county is like night and day. Thank you very much, sir. You've made a major difference. Right? I'm on the dispatch committee, and I want to bring something to your attention. All right. When we had we have two contracts, a geo comm contract and a pillar contract, which is now Stratia or whatever. All right. When we had our meeting, one of my basic questions was, what phase of those contracts are we in? Because Sandy had resigned and no one else, and Gary wasn't there, no one could answer the question. So I went to Miss Nick and got the payouts for them, making the assumption that that would match what was in the contract. Oh my God. All right. Geocom's contract said $57,190.60.
Annual contract or what's the
Total over the time of the contract. It was signed in, what is it? July, I believe, of 18 or something like that. All right. Total paid out $70,153.60. I don't know what the differences are. It was paid in 3 amounts, and generally the amounts are close to the, proportionally to what they were to be in the contract. The only one I have a concern for is the last one. And the last one was not to be paid until the system is totally accepted. And it's been paid, all right? And the reason that the system should not be accepted is the county's fault. We did not provide the data to Pillar on time because the chiefs didn't meet and so forth and so on, all right? That's the better news. Pillar contract, total value, 49,160. Total payments, 105, 204. All right, I can't explain the difference. If you look at the payouts, they don't align at all with the schedule of payments. So I don't know what happened, all right? But I think of the Geocom, I don't know if you added, Gary, if you added a second console or whatever, but you didn't give me any contract mods, so I assume this is what the contract is.
And that was just Pillar, not
No,
Stratia or whatever the other one.
Something not right with that information.
All right. Two recommendations. One, I assume Gary will now look at this and you can have, if he wants the numbers, he can have them.
I can pull the number.
You can pull them. The second thing is that I've learned from this is I would recommend that the constitutional officers and other critical employees that are involved in contracts get some really basic procurement training. Because making that system go live before it was ready was a mistake. All right, I don't want to shoot anyone anywhere. This is the new page, I guess. So but we just need to get some people training if we're going to have major contracts like this. Gary is a one-man show. He can't be everywhere watching every technical representative that they're, I don't know how the receipts were paid, or invoices were paid or whatever. Interesting little detail on both contracts. The first payment was made days before the contract was signed. And the first payment to Pillar was the total value of the contract. So it needs to, something went on, I don't know. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Anyone on Zoom that could possibly want to speak, please raise your hand in Zoom world.
Mr. Grimsley has her hand raised.
Good evening, Shannon Grimsley, Rappahannock County Schools Superintendent. Just want
Uh-oh,
Uh-oh,
cut out on us.
try again. Dr. Grimsley?
If she's connecting from home, then
Okay.
her connection may not be great. She was with us that whole time.
Poor thing. Is there an option just to dial in, or do you have to go through Zoom?
Yeah. that's-
Say this, in the daytime I can understand it when birds fly between the signal, but at night there's only owls.
Yeah, she may be,
Excuse me, she back?
maybe.
Maybe.
I'm
Try-
back. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Did you cut me off? Just kidding. Really, I think it's a jargon differentiation. For us, that means a mandated, it's mandated if you wish to receive Richmond money or federal money. So for instance, like our Title I funds to serve at-risk students, that's about $175,000 a year. So no, I guess it's not a direct mandate, but if you do want to receive that funding, you do have to implement those practices. A difference would be something like your ESL mandates that provide very, very little dollars. For instance, taking care of your ESL population with services, which is your English language learners, would yield us about $3,800. So you would say, okay, well, that's really not much with all this protocol that has to go with it, but it's a mandate through OCR, your Office of Civil Rights. So you have to, of course, take care of the rights of those students. So I think it's a jargon differentiation, but I do overall want to commend Mr. Curry for an excellent presentation and also to the Board of Supervisors and all that you have done to step up to the plate to really take care of the families in Rappahannock and our students. We could not have reopened successfully without your help. And I think that has really been showcased throughout the year. It has been very, very challenging, and without your support and your ongoing dialogue about our challenges, we wouldn't be able to accomplish what we have. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. And also, I have one question too about the rollout of new stimulus money for COVID relief and the second rollout of CARES or ESSER 2 for us. Mr. Curry, do you anticipate any additional dollars coming in through any COVID relief dollars? I didn't see that in the presentation, just wondering.
Yeah, there's nothing right now. The obviously Congress just approved today, and supposedly Friday, the president will sign whatever this latest package is called. And we are slated to receive direct funding, significant direct funding from that can be used for a number of things, to include broadband. So the Board of Supervisors will have to look at that when we know it's coming in and what it is and when it is, and see how that will be invested. Oh, she muted herself.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Grimsley.
Anybody else on there? Can't see. Doesn't look like it.
Ms. Ramos and Ms. McKiernan are apparently on. I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. No hands raised on the screen. I'll close public comment and entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
That's Ms. Smith and Mr. Parrish. We have a first and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Even in church, they have a question.